familiar with the phrase, what you say can and will be used against you. Words used against you or spoken to others, as you know, can hurt and can be damaging. While stupidity is vast and varied, I heard someone the other day say to a loved one, "I love you just the way you are." And then went on to, although I do have a few suggestions. I don't need to tell you what the response was because we're in church. And I often wonder why in the world do sometimes we open our mouth and implicate ourselves. As we continue in our journey in the book of Acts, we are going to see the predictable outcome of words. Would you turn with me to Acts chapter 6, beginning with the 8th verse? Acts chapter 6, beginning with the 8th verse, as we continue to move forward in our Acts series. Now Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, did great wonders and miraculous signs among the people. However, opposition did arise from the members of the synagogue of the freedmen, as it were called, Jews of Cyrene, Alexandria, as well as the provinces of Cilicia and Asia. These men began to argue with Stephen, but they could not stand up against his wisdom or the spirit by which he spoke. Then they secretly persuaded some of the men to say, "We have heard Stephen's words of blasphemy against Moses and against God." So they stirred up the people and the elders of the teachers of the law. They seized Stephen and they brought him before the Sanhedrin. They produced false witnesses who testified, "This fellow never stops talking or speaking against this holy place and against the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs of Moses handed down to us." All who were sitting in the Sanhedrin looked intently at Stephen, and they saw that his face was like the face of an angel. This shall be part one of a two-part series with our focus upon Stephen. Because the biggest question that comes to us almost immediately is found in verse 9, where we talk about the people of this region, the people of this place. Why were the people from these particular regions that we have mentioned specifically so upset? Well, for starters, not one of the 7 men chosen in the lesson from last week, which included Stephen, had a Jewish name. In fact, Nicholas was a Gentile who had accepted the Jewish faith. Moreover, what is interesting about these 7 men, as you recall from last week, was that they all needed to be full of the Spirit, that they all needed to be willing to serve, but more importantly, as we talked about it, had the ability to cross over either side of the fence because there was a lot of tension there. Stephen obviously stood out from amongst the 7 men chosen. Look at verse 8. Now Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, did great wonders and miraculous signs among the people. Stephen, in his service to the Lord, who had the ability, like the others, to not only serve and share, but he found himself now on the other side of the fence. And who he encountered would become important as to where this dialogue would take us and why it would take 2 parts for us to finish this. he encountered some die-hard traditionalists who embraced Orthodox Jewish belief. It is important to know that you should be aware of what that was so that you understand where all of the arguments were coming from. First of all, the Orthodox Jewish belief looked upon themselves, as you recall, and we still have the terminology today, that the people of Israel, the Jewish nation, was always considered to be, especially as they viewed themselves, the chosen people. They were the chosen ones. However, in the earlier days, these chosen ones believed, and they practiced, that they were chosen for special privilege. And they believed that God had absolutely no use at all for any other nation. They especially hated the Gentiles. Secondly, they believed that the temple was sacred. It was there that they could sacrifice, hold up sacrifices before God and get right with Him in order to stand before Him in His great presence. Thirdly, they embraced the law as their own. That this would be the foundation in which they would live their lives. But especially, they believed that the Ten Commandments given to them by Moses was foundational in their belief system. And they believed all of this could never, ever change. Fourthly, they, like many Jews of this region, did not believe Jesus to be the long-awaited Messiah. Now, it's interesting to note that there are still some in our day who are still waiting for the Messiah to come. However, the Jews of this region absolutely despised Stephen. Why? And that seems to be the biggest question here. Why did they despise Stephen so much? Well, the truth of the matter is it didn't matter for whether Stephen or anybody else. If they were a Jew, a Messianic Jew who claimed Christ or came from the church, that early church started in Jerusalem, it wouldn't have mattered what your name was. But they stood up against this man in a confrontation. Stephen came offering good things. He came to offer food to the widows or anything else that they might have needed on behalf of the church of Jerusalem. The church that embraced Jesus. They were not happy with that. Therefore, it was their goal to go talk some sense into this man. Look at the last part of verse 9. These men decided to go out and confront Stephen. And so they began to argue with him. But they could not stand up against his wisdom or the spirit by which he spoke. Now, we do not know what was said in that confrontation. However, we do know that the people of this particular region were very satisfied and very content of keeping things just the way they were. They didn't look for anything else to invade their land. They regarded Jesus and all of his followers, again, didn't matter who that was, and all of his followers as what? Threats. Invaders. Those who would come into the land and take away what they had gained. Now, I'm pretty sure that in this confrontation, Stephen reminded them that man had worshipped God long before there was ever a temple. And he probably insisted that God does not dwell exclusively in the temple. For you see, Stephen believed in the very teachings of Christ himself in very much the same way that we see it as well. believe that the gospel was and is designed for all nations and for all people to have, which of course would include the Gentiles. I believe the damaging blow came when he reminded them that they were in fact responsible for Jesus' death, and also the prophets and the abandoned leaders in whom God had raised up. Ooh-wee, Jimmy Jim. Wow. This religious debate very quickly turned into a hate debate. There was nothing religious about it at all, except from Stephen's perspective. I believe he was true and sincere from his heart, but these people were not seeing it that way, not from any perspective. These pretend God followers were determined to get rid of Stephen. Why do we know that? Scriptures tell us that. Verses 11 through 14. After they had this debate and realized they could not stand up against his wisdom or the Holy Spirit of God, they then, now catch this, they then secretly persuaded some of the men who were present to say, "We have heard Stephen speak words of blasphemy against Moses and against God." So they stirred up the people and the elders and the teachers of the law. They stirred up everyone around them. And at that, they seized Stephen. And they didn't bring him into just their little group. You recall in a couple lessons back that they wanted to do the apostles in the Sanhedrin Council. And that was going to take place, except for the fact that they weren't counting on somebody by the name of Gamaliel who would stand up as God would use and spare their life. So they were very cautious this time. They were determined. They wanted somebody's head. No question about that. And so they brought Stephen before who? The Sanhedrin. And they produced false witnesses. Can you imagine that? Who testified and said, "This fellow never stops talking about this holy place and preaches against the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs of Moses handed down to us." Wow. It's kind of hard to know where to even begin. The abuse of power and authority from this time frame to today, I'm here to tell you, is still present. Amen. The hypocrisy and the actions of the men who were present in this arena not only violated their own law that was set forth by God, but the most sacred, the Ten Commandments, in which they also violated. Clearly, their rage and their emotions was greater than their convictions and their belief. Premeditatively, they plotted, they schemed, they lied to get results that they were hoping for. In other words, I'm here to tell you, Stephen's goose was cooked. Why do we know that? It discloses it. Verse 11, first part. Then they secretly persuaded others to say. Verse 13. They produced false witnesses. Their hypocrisy was clear. In other words, as we look at what was predictable, what was seen, and what was going to take place, the question is simply this: did they really need a valid excuse to eliminate this man? You be the judge. because as it begins in its dialogue and makes it clear to its very end. In verse 14, they said falsely against him, "For we have heard this man say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs of Moses." So here's the bigger question. If they did not believe Jesus to be the Messiah, and if they or their predecessors helped put Jesus to death, then I ask you, where is the threat? Because Jesus was dead. Where's the threat? Or did they really believe that one of his followers could rise to power and influence the bedrock of their own belief system? Not as long as they were living. And so again, even the question that they put up as part of their defense, I'm thinking, where is your defense? Where is this threat that you keep talking about? Because you put it to death, just as you are about to put this man to death. How could this be a violation in your eyes? Let me just say that, like any cartel, no one was going to set up shop in their territory. That was clear. Invaders and violators needed to be eliminated. Now, up to this point, members of this sect could not eliminate someone without Roman authority and their approval. It was a long and political process, as we have already seen. What this group really needed, and they were certainly aware of it, what this group really needed was some kind of a godfather, a mobster boss, who could buy off and intimidate others to help speed up this process and eliminate all of the go-betweens. A man who was both powerful and influential. One who at the very heart and core of who he was in fact corrupt. One who lurked in the shadows. One whose reputation was known to both the Roman authorities, to the Pharisees, and to the Sadducees, the entire council of the Sanhedrin body. A man whose influence would be able to do all the dirty work and all of the deeds that they could not do or would not do. He would be accountable to no one. We're sitting there going, wow, boy, are we off script or what? Was there such a man? Yes, there was. As a matter of fact, he is a new and upper-comer. He was quickly coming to power and known to all segments of this society and of this entire region. Ironically, he comes from a region that we've already mentioned in this passage. And it's found in verse 9. When we're talking about the Jews of Cyrene and Alexandria, the provinces of Cilicia and Asia, he would come from Cilicia. Cilicia was a region whose southern borders rested upon the Mediterranean Sea. And its largest city in this country was Tarsus. We will be introduced to him in part 2 of our series. Thus, we conclude with that very interesting verse in verse 15. And I find this one intriguing. Verse 15 says, "And all who were sitting in the Sanhedrin, who were looking at Stephen, who had listened to all of these people falsely testify against him, they were all looking intently at Stephen, and they saw that he had a face like the face of an angel." Talk about two sides of the spectrum. On one side, men whose faces were filled with hate and rage and sitting on the edge. Like a tiger, a lion, they were ready to pounce. On the other side was Stephen, whose face had the appearance of an angel. I'm here to tell you that the Lord had not abandoned Stephen. And everybody in that chamber observed Stephen's face. And I'm also here to tell you that it was God's warning to everybody who was sitting there. However, it did not matter one iota to these men what he looked like. They were determined to do what they were going to do. And next week we'll see the outcome of that. Thus, the lesson that we gain from our lesson today is this. Satan is still the prince of darkness. Much of the discord and the conflict that we see and observe even today reminds us that Satan is having a field day. It's important. I think it's extremely important. And we see that in our devotions that we gain every day. Everybody who reads these things, everybody who knows these things, everybody has the opportunity to get this thing right. And so this is why I'm a firm believer, and thank you for the cards that allows us to read through the Word, Jason, for the devotions. Everything is a reminder of the importance of being able to start your day with the Lord. Because the days are dark, and the days are sinister. And I believe with all my heart that Satan's not only having a field day, but he also has assigned some of his mean little nasty demons to be a part of your life. Whether you invite them in or not, he has invited them into your life. So it's important that you start your day with the Lord. To power up, to pray up, and to put on your armor, as I know many of you ladies are studying right now. Be alert. Be prepared. Be proactive. And be ready. And be ready to encounter Satan, who often works through other people. And while there are some situations that you cannot avoid, you pray that God will give you the strength to stand up, be heard, be strong. This is what got Stephen in trouble. Wrong place, wrong time. He was trying to serve, to share, but found himself up against some of Satan's little rodents running around. And they sure did not want him in their place. They could have been, like what we looked at last week, just be a few catbirds and chase him out of their territory. But they weren't satisfied with that. Why? Because they knew the Sanhedrin wanted to do something nasty. Why? Because a new and up-and-comer was now to become a very powerful force in and among them, so he would be now Big Brother, a godfather, a mobster boss. He could eliminate anybody without anybody asking any questions at all. We're going to see that as we move forward. Mean, nasty, powerful. So what kind of world can you encounter? We say, well, we don't encounter that kind of day. We don't encounter those kind of people. But they're all out there. Even when you leave this place, even when you encounter sometimes other people in other places, in other arenas, they're there. Now, percentage-wise, we may not always have those confrontations. Thank God we live in America, where there's at least some sanity of order. But I can assure you that those who have to deal with those people, law enforcement people, people who encounter these people from a variety of different perspectives, have encountered some of the worst of our society, and they do exist. And we say, okay, well, that's in the big towns, in the big cities. No, it's not. 14 years as a chaplain, I rode with some of the finest here. I've seen it. Some of it is pathetic, some of it is comical, some of it is just downright evil. All I'm saying is that you need to prepare yourself. You need to prepare yourself to encounter whatever you're going to encounter every single day. Be proactive in your outreach. Be proactive in the way you go about business. Because Satan does work through other people. And let me leave you this reminder. You've heard it before, maybe 1,000 times before, but it all applies. For greater is He who lives within you than he that is in the world. And for that, all of God's people say, Amen.